Minjin and his sister Minseo were twins born to a noble family. Even as children, Minjin and his sister were often dressed in the same clothes. But while Minseo was gentle, Minjin had a spark of stubbornness and sass that often got him into trouble. Despite his mother always telling him to behave, he had a habit of challenging anyone who looked down on him or his family, and Minjin's parents loved that about him. As they grew, the twins remained close, and they were often mistaken for each other. One fateful day, a royal messenger arrived from the neighboring kingdom with a letter. The contents were clear. It was a betrothal agreement proposed by the royal house. As one of the noble families close to the royal family, Minjin and Minseo's family had expected such an arrangement someday. It wasn't unusual for noble families to receive marriage offers for their children, but this one was unique. It was addressed to the daughter of the household. But the messenger, seeing Minjin, especially in one of the beautifully decorated outfits his mother had worn him, didn't hesitate to assume he was the one being offered. The error was embarrassing, but it seemed simple enough to fix. However, for reasons that even Minjin's father couldn't entirely explain, the family decided to let the betrothal proceed. As the years went by, Minjin grew up with the quiet knowledge that his sister's future had been decided and that she was betrothed to the prince. With a mixture of guilt and curiosity, Minjin would sometimes imagine what the prince might be like, although he didn't let the thought linger. He and his sister spoke of it rarely, both of them assuming Minseo would eventually be the one to go through with the marriage. Minseo, who had always been nervous about the arrangement, looked at her brother one evening with a nervous smile, saying, "I'm glad you don't have to do this, Minjin." Minjin chuckled, feeling a pang of guilt and nervousness on her behalf. "Don't worry," he replied lightly. "You'll be married off to a spoiled prince while I stay here, living my life as I want," he said jokingly. The day finally came. The prince, Hanyul, had come of age and was ready to meet and marry his betrothed. It was expected that the two would live together immediately. To strengthen the alliance between their families, Minjin and Minseo were dressed beautifully. But Minjin couldn't help but notice that he was adorned with more jewelries than his sister, and his clothes seemed more beautiful and almost royal-like. He tried not to think of it too much as they were already on their way to the palace, where the formal introduction between their families would take place, and where Minseo and Minjin expected the mistake to be cleared up. When they finally settled in the palace, the royal family made no move to correct it. Instead, as their father introduced the betrothed, Minjin's name was announced. Minjin froze, his heart pounding as everyone in the room turned to him. He turned to his sister, who looked equally horrified, her mouth falling open as she realized what had happened. Minjin had been the one betrothed to the prince all along. Minjin could feel everyone's eyes on him. He swallowed hard, and was about to protest, but before he could say a word, his father, with a steady smile, stepped forward to address the gathered nobles. "It is with pride that I formally announce the union between our family and the royal house." His father spoke, his voice steady, but his eyes held a flicker of apology as he glanced at Minjin. "Our son, Minjin, will honor this pact by joining with Prince Hanyul in an arrangement that will strengthen the bond between our families." Minjin felt like the room was spinning. How could they do this to him? His own parents hadn't told him, hadn't prepared him, and now, standing in the midst of the nobles, he was supposed to pretend like he'd agreed to this all along. He felt angry. He kept his face blank, but his eyes showed the betrayal he felt. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Prince Hanyul step forward, tall and lean, with the kind of majestic grace Minjin could never imagine himself pulling off. The prince had a bored look on his face as his eyes swept over Minjin, assessing him briefly, and then looked away as if he'd seen nothing worth commenting on. Minjin's jaw tightened. Of course he's a spoiled brat, he thought instantly, raised to think he's above everyone. And here Minjin was, expected to marry this prince and live peacefully at his side. The marriage proceeded with speeches and some parades, but Minjin barely registered them. He kept his gaze firmly fixed somewhere else, forcing himself not to react when the prince occasionally glanced his way. When the introductions and formalities concluded, Minjin barely noticed his parents' well wishes or his sister's whispered apology. Soon enough, he found himself alone with Hanyul, in a private chamber where they were meant to share. The prince leaned casually against the wall, crossing his arms as he looked Minjin over. "So you're the one they picked for me?" Hanyul's voice dripped in amusement. Minjin raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "No, actually, it was a mistake. I wasn't supposed to be the one betrothed to you." Hanyul's smirk grew. "A mistake? I didn't realize the noble houses were so careless with marriage arrangements." He shrugged, "But I suppose it's no matter now. We're stuck with each other." "Believe me, I'm not thrilled about it either, Your Highness," Minjin replied, folding his arms to mirror Hanyul. "You don't exactly seem like my type." Hanyul raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by Minjin's attitude. "And what would your type be?" "Someone who doesn't assume they're better than everyone else." Minjin shot back, holding the prince's gaze. Han Yul blinked, then let out a short surprised laugh that seemed to catch Minjin off guard. Well, at least you're honest, Han Yul said with a smile. But most people don't get away with speaking to me like that. Oh, am I supposed to bow and pretend that you're the greatest person I've ever met just because you're royalty? Minjin asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Han Yul's smirk faltered, his gaze narrowing. Watch yourself, Minjin, he said, his tone lowering. This isn't the home you're used to. You're in my domain now and things won't go well for you if you keep testing me. Minjin's heart raced, but he refused to let the prince intimidate him. He took a step forward, meeting Han Yul's stare without flinching. If you expect me to fawn over you, you're going to be disappointed. I didn't ask for this marriage. And I certainly didn't ask to be stuck with a prince who thinks he's untouchable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the tension hanging thick in the air. Han Yul's expression was unreadable, but there was a glint in his eyes, something almost like interest, maybe even a hint of admiration. Then, just as quickly, he masked it, his mouth curling into a smirk. Well, this should be interesting at least. I wonder how long it'll take for you to break. That night, Minjin was made to sleep in the same room with the prince, an arrangement that forced them into each other's space far more than he would have liked. He stood at the edge of the huge bed, looking nervously around the room. For all his sass and bold remarks, nothing could have prepared him for this moment. The reality that he was supposed to consummate his marriage with Prince Han Yul was sinking in, and his heart hammered a little louder in his chest. Prince Han Yul was already on the bed, leaning casually against the bedpost, a small smirk on his lips as he watched Minjin's visible discomfort. He could read Minjin like a book, the nervous fidgeting, the way his hands squeezed together and the anxious glances toward the bed. Relax, Han Yul finally said, the calmness in his voice somehow soothing. Nothing has to happen tonight. Minjin blinked, looking up at him with surprise. Wait, really? But we're supposed to. He couldn't even finish the sentence, his cheeks heating up as he imagined what should happen. Han Yul's smirk grew a little wider. Yes, traditionally we're supposed to seal the deal, so to speak, but all that matters is that they believe we did. Let them think what they want. In the morning, we'll let them believe what they want to about our night. Minjin released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, relief washing over him. So we just sleep. Han Yul nodded. Yes, Minjin, we just sleep. Minjin, still processing this, quickly crawled into his side of the bed, turning his back to Han Yul. Great, I'll just sleep then. Han Yul chuckled softly, sliding under the covers himself, keeping a respectable distance. And in no time, they both drifted off into a surprisingly peaceful sleep. The next morning, however, Minjin's relief was cut short. Just as he was starting to wake, he barely had time to open his eyes when a maid entered, her face practically glowing with curiosity. Good morning, my lord. How was the night? The maid asked excitedly, wiggling her eyebrows as her eyes immediately darting to Minjin's rumpled bedclothes. Minjin's eyes widened as he realized that they really expect them to talk about it. Trying to keep his composure, he glanced over to Han Yul, who was lying there with his eyes closed, clearly faking to be asleep to escape this whole ordeal. He cleared his throat. The night was, it was quite a night, he stuttered. The maid leaned in, looking curious. Oh, really? What did it sound like? Minjin's face flushed, but he wasn't about to let this maid think they'd done nothing. So with his mind racing, he went with the first thing that came to him. It was wild, he whispered, glancing shyly around the room as if sharing a forbidden secret. Oh, the maid's eyes went even wider. Do tell. Minjin wondered why the maid was so chatty and curious, and he didn't want to talk about it. But he also didn't want the maid to be suspicious even a little bit. Well, it started with, a lot of eye contact, Minjin said, trying to sound as mysterious as possible. He looked at me like he'd been starving for years. And then he, Minjin swallowed, trying not to cringe at his own words. He pinned me against the bed, like, instantly. The maid let out a gasp of pure delight. And then, Minjin continued, his confidence growing, he practically tore my robe off, said something about how he couldn't possibly wait another second, and the things he said. Minjin waved his hand as if he couldn't even begin to describe it, though in truth he couldn't think of anything at all. The maid leaned closer, hanging on his every word. What kind of things? Oh, he, said I was like a rare precious jewel, and that he would, cherish me forever. Very, poetic. Minjin nodded at his own words. The maid squealed softly, clutching her hands to her chest. Oh, that's so romantic. And was he, good? Minjin couldn't help himself now. He was fully committed to this wild tale. Amazing, he whispered, pretending to be reminiscing over what had in fact not happened. He has incredible stamina. I lost count of how many times he. Minjin paused for effect, letting her imagination do the work. You get the idea. The maid's jaw dropped. I never would have guessed the prince had it in him. Right, me neither, Minjin said, barely managing to keep a straight face. Just then, he noticed Hanyul's eyes open just a tiny bit, watching him with an expression of amused disbelief. The prince shifted slightly, clearing his throat in a way that was almost a chuckle. He sat up, glancing pointedly at Minjin. Is there something I missed? Hanyul asked smoothly, with just a hint of amusement in his voice. Minjin froze, his face heating as he remembered Hanyul was awake all along. Oh, no, nothing. We were just discussing the night, the maid answered. Yes, Hanyul said, fighting back a smirk as he looked over at Minjin. It was memorable. The maid practically squealed with delight, hurrying off to probably spread the rumors of the wild first night. Once she was gone, Minjin shot Hanyul an annoyed look. You heard all that, didn't you? Hanyul's smirk grew. Every word. Minjin groaned, his face burning as he buried it in his hands. Hanyul chuckled, leaning back against the pillows with a satisfied grin. Don't worry, Minjin. Your secret's safe with me. The next morning, Minjin was still recovering from the previous evening's mortifying conversation with Hanyul when the door to their chambers swung open, and in came none other than Queen Dowager Suk, Hanyul's mother. Ah, there's my new son-in-law, she announced, beaming at Minjin, who immediately shot up, nearly tripping over his own feet as he tried to bow. Hanyul, on the other hand, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Mother, he greeted with a polite nod, his expression tight. To what do we owe this early visit? Oh, Hanyul, I came to see how my new daughter. She paused, realizing her error with a laugh. My new son-in-law is settling in. After all, it's not every day that the royal family gains a unique addition. Her eyes sparkled mischievously as she looked between the two of them. Minjin offered a timid smile, fidgeting under her gaze. Thank you, Your Majesty. I'm settling in just fine. Wonderful, she exclaimed. Now, dear Minjin, I hope my son has been treating you well. She shot a pointed look at Hanyul, who was now visibly uncomfortable. Mother, Hanyul protested. I think Minjin and I are managing perfectly fine without assistance. Queen Suk only smiled wider. Oh, I'm sure you two are managing just fine. But marriage is so much more than managing, dear. She turned to Minjin and winked, especially the consummation, which I'm sure you both know is expected soon, if not done already, she said with a smirk. Minjin went as red as a tomato, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He could practically feel Hanyul's cringe beside him. Ah, well, yes, last night, Hanyul stepped in quickly, clearing his throat. Mother, there's no need to concern yourself with such intimate matters. Oh, don't be shy, Hanyul. Minjin is family now. There's no need to hide anything. She patted Minjin's hand in reassurance. After all, I heard quite the tale from the servants this morning about how wild your night was. Minjin's eyes widened, and he gave a nervous laugh. Yes, wild. So much wildness. Honestly, I barely remember it myself. He winced inwardly as Hanyul shot him a horrified look. Queen Suk seemed delighted by this response, fanning herself dramatically. I knew you'd make a charming couple. The kingdom will be so pleased to see such passion between you both. The silence that followed was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Minjin, desperate to change the topic, looked up at her. Actually, if I may, Your Majesty, I've been wondering, why did the royal family still want this marriage to go forward? You know, even after it became clear I was a boy. Queen Suk raised her eyebrows, looking surprised. Oh, Minjin, that's a fair question. But you see, when you were promised, the alliance was more important than a mere misunderstanding about your appearance. But wouldn't my sister have been a more appropriate match? The queen smiled, shaking her head. No, dear. We may have promised a daughter initially, but when we realized it was you, we saw it as a twist of fate. And of course we suspected you would be just the right match to keep Hanyul on his toes. She winked. Mother, please, Hanyul said, looking embarrassed. Minjin stifled a grin, feeling oddly pleased. Well, I'll do my best to fulfill those expectations. The queen rose, looking pleased with herself. I'm sure you will, Minjin. With one last beaming smile, Queen Suk left. Hanyul groaned, pinching the bridge of his nose. I apologize for my mother, he muttered. She has a talent for meddling. Minjin chuckled, finally feeling a bit more at ease. Oh, I don't mind. She was charming. Yes, I'm sure she was, Hanyul replied, sarcasm lacing his voice. They both went to the dining hall to eat, but barely a minute into breakfast, the palace advisors approached him, bowing respectfully before delivering the news. Minjin was expected in the training hall to begin his lessons on the duties of a royal spouse. What kind of duties? He asked suspiciously, looking between the advisors and Hanyul, who sat across from him at the table, looking entirely too amused by the conversation. The oldest advisor cleared his throat. You'll be learning about your responsibilities as the prince's husband, how to carry yourself with grace, how to manage the prince's household, and of course, the advisor hesitated, before stating, the more intimate aspects of your role. Minjin's face turned red as a tomato. Intimate aspects. He shot a horrified glance at Hanyul, who raised his eyebrows, pretending not to understand Minjin's embarrassment. Do I really have to? Minjin whispered. Hanyul took a sip of tea, clearly enjoying the moment. Of course, Minjin. After all, they just want to help you be the best spouse you can be. Don't you agree? Minjin scowled, blushing. I think I already know how to be a husband. Thanks. The advisor raised a single eyebrow. Oh, I'm sure there is much to learn, my lord. Please, follow me. For the next few days, Minjin endured lessons that were nothing short of mortifying. He learned how to court seductively, whatever that meant. He learned how to walk with his chin up and shoulders back, how to sit just close enough to Hanyul so that they looked romantic but not improper. And worst of all, he was expected to learn about the art of marital closeness, a lesson that sent him running out of the room at least twice. Each time Minjin came back from these trainings, Hanyul would be waiting in their quarters, grinning from ear to ear. How was today's lesson? He would ask, looking too innocent. Don't ask, Minjin would grumble, slumping down in his chair. Learn anything useful. Hanyul teased, barely hiding his smirk. I heard they're quite thorough about the art of closeness. Minjin grabbed a pillow and threw it at Hanyul's head. Not another word. But despite his protests, the lessons continued, each one more embarrassing than the last. Until one morning, after yet another grueling session on a lesson called Proper Bedroom Etiquette, Minjin decided he'd had enough. The next day, he didn't show up for his lesson. Instead, he curled up in bed, pulling the covers over his head. When Hanyul walked in and found Minjin hiding under the blankets, he raised an eyebrow, biting back a laugh. Minjin, are you sick? Minjin nodded, his voice muffled. Yes, very sick. Fever, chills, the whole thing. I might even be contagious. Really? Hanyul's eyes sparkled with amusement as he walked over, pressing a hand to Minjin's forehead in mock concern. Feels like you're completely fine to me. I'm just not showing symptoms right now, but it's very serious. I'll probably be bedridden for at least a week. Hanyul chuckled, sitting down on the edge of the bed. Would this sickness have anything to do with your recent lessons? Minjin groaned, pulling the covers tighter over his head. I'm never going back there, Hanyul. I'd rather be bedridden forever than have another marital closeness lesson. Hanyul chuckled, enjoying this way too much. After a moment, he sighed and leaned back, raising his voice in an authoritative manner. Then it settled. Minjin is unwell and will not be attending any more lessons until further notice. Minjin peeked out from under the blanket, surprised. Really? Hanyul winked. Consider it a royal decree. You're officially excused. Later in the day, word had spread that Minjin was too unwell for his duties, and his lessons were officially cancelled. The royal staff brought him tea, some warm blankets and any comfort food he asked for, all while he lay in bed, grinning to himself. That evening, Hanyul entered their shared quarters, looking far too cheerful for Minjin's comfort. As Minjin sat on the bed, enjoying his recovery, Hanyul took a seat across from him. His eyes filled with mischief. So, I'm curious, you've been going to these lessons for days now. Care to share some details? I'd love to know what they've been teaching my faithful husband. Minjin felt the color rise to his cheeks as he shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Hanyul's gaze. Nothing interesting, he waving his hand dismissively. Just the basics, you know, like pouring tea, arranging flowers, stuff like that. Oh, really? Hanyul smirked, clearly not buying it. That's all. I've heard these lessons are very thorough when it comes to husband duties. Are you saying they didn't teach you other things? Minjin's face went from pink to crimson. They may have mentioned a few things, but it's not important. Hanyul's grin only widened. No, I think it's very important. I mean, I'd hate for my husband to be unprepared for his role, especially since these lessons are so valuable. He leaned in closer, watching Minjin squirm with amusement. So did they teach you how to sit appropriately close to your husband? Minjin swallowed. remembering the advisor's stern instructions on maintaining the right amount of romantic proximity. Yes, sort of, he mumbled, feeling trapped under Hanyul's playful gaze. Apparently, I should sit close enough to, project affection, but not so close that it seems improper. Like this. Hanyul moved a bit closer, his shoulder brushing against Minjin's as he looked at him with a teasing smile. Minjin's throat went dry. I think, maybe a little farther. Hanyul laughed, not moving back, clearly enjoying every second of this. Interesting. So did they teach you anything else? Any other duties you might be expected to perform? Minjin buried his face in his hands, groaning. If you must know, they mentioned how to, look at you in a way that's, inviting, I guess. He peeked through his fingers, cheeks blazing. Hanyul leaned back, his laughter filling the room. Oh, I'd love to see that. Minjin shot him a glare, finally summoning the courage to talk back. Maybe if you weren't such a spoiled prince, you'd know what that looks like already. Hanyul's eyebrow shot up, smirking. Oh. Do you think I need a lesson in receiving affection from my husband? He moved closer. Perhaps you should demonstrate some of those techniques then. After all, isn't that what you've been learning? Minjin's heart was pounding, and he opened his mouth, scrambling for some witty comeback. But he could only stammer. You wouldn't be able to handle it. Hanyul's laugh softened, turning into a smile that seemed almost sincere. Oh, Minjin, he murmured, his voice lower now. I think I'd handle it just fine. Before Hanyul could move even closer, Minjin scrambled to his feet and basically sprinted out of the room, hearing Hanyul's laughter echoing through the halls. A few days later, the peace between Minjin and Hanyul took a dramatic turn with the arrival of Lord Taijo, a young nobleman known for his charm. The moment he arrived, he seemed to be everywhere Minjin went, flashing a dashing smile and offering compliments at every opportunity. When Minjin attended his daily duties around the palace, Taijo would find an excuse to accompany him, making flattering remarks that left Minjin flustered and stammering. Your robe looks exquisite today, Lord Minjin, Taijo said one afternoon, his gaze lingering a little too long. Not that you don't look marvelous every day. Minjin laughed awkwardly, pulling his robe a bit tighter. Thank you, Lord Taijo. You're, very kind. Just call me Taijo, he replied, his smile widening as he leaned in. No need for such formalities between us. Before Minjin could respond, a voice cut through the air like a blade. Actually, I think Lord Taijo is just fine, Hanyul said, his tone low and unmistakably cold as he appeared in the doorway. Minjin glanced up, startled by Hanyul's sudden arrival, and noticed the way the prince glared at Taijo. Oh, Your Highness, Taijo said with a bow, flashing a smirk that was challenging. You don't mind if I keep Lord Minjin company, do you? He's just been so delightful to talk to. Hanyul's jaw tightened, though he kept his composure. Lord Minjin has many responsibilities, and I wouldn't want you to distract him, he replied, his voice clipped. Oh, but I think a little distraction suits him. I mean, look at him. A face like that deserves some appreciation, don't you think? Taijo responded, smiling at Minjin. Minjin went pink, immediately looking away. I really don't think that's necessary. But Taijo only chuckled, seemingly enjoying the prince's rising tension. Come now, Minjin. I hope you know how captivating you are. Taijo leaned in just enough that Minjin could feel his breath near his ear. Hanyul's gaze darkened, and he took a step forward. Lord Taijo, I think Minjin has been entertained enough, he said, barely hiding the anger in his tone. After all, he's still my husband, and I'm sure you wouldn't want to overstep. Taijo raised his eyebrows, clearly amused. Of course, Your Highness, he replied, holding up his hands in mock surrender. I'd never dream of overstepping. But as he turned to leave, he shot Minjin one last lingering glance, his gaze sweeping up and down in a way that made Minjin feel a little exposed. As soon as Taijo left, Hanyul immediately went to stand in front of Minjin. You certainly seem to be enjoying his attention, he said, folding his arms across his chest. Minjin's eyes widened. I wasn't. He's just friendly. Hanyul scoffed. He was practically embracing you with his eyes. Minjin tried not to laugh, though the image made his cheeks warm. Oh, come on. You're being ridiculous. Ridiculous. Hanyul's brows shot up. That man has no respect for boundaries, especially not when it comes to my husband. Minjin's heart fluttered a bit at the word husband, even if Hanyul didn't quite seem to mean it. He raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. Hanyul, are you jealous? The prince's face flushed, and he looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Jealous? Don't be absurd. I just dislike his manners, that's all. Oh, really? Minjin teased, moving a little closer. Because from where I was standing, it looked like you were. Hanyul glared, but there was a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. He doesn't know you like I do. You deserve better than cheap flattery, Minjin. Minjin couldn't resist a smirk. Well, Your Highness, maybe I like a bit of cheap flattery now and then. It's refreshing. Hanyul's jaw clenched. Is that so? He took a step closer, his presence suddenly intense. Then maybe I should remind you what it means to be a prince's spouse. Before Minjin could respond, Hanyul took his hand, pulling him closer until their faces were mere inches apart, his hand sliding to the small of his back. Minjin's breath hitched, and for a moment he forgot all about Taijo's flirtations. Remember Minjin? Hanyul murmured, his voice low. You're my husband. No one else gets to claim that. His gaze flickered down to Minjin's lips for just a second before he pulled away, leaving Minjin breathless. As Hanyul walked away, Minjin's heart raced in his chest. He'd never seen this side of Hanyul before, and he liked it. He wanted to see the prince snap, so he decided to entertain Taijo just a little bit. In the days that followed, Taijo seemed to increase his presence around the palace, always with that confident smile directed at Minjin, and Minjin would respond just enough to catch Hanyul's eye. He would laugh anytime Taijo would make a joke, even if it wasn't funny, and touch Taijo's arm subtly whenever he saw the prince near. And the prince was always near. One evening in the dining hall, Taijo sat beside Minjin, whispering something amusing and of course a little flirtatious. Minjin laughed, leaning just slightly toward him, and Taijo's hand grazed Minjin's arm, lingering just a second too long, from the corner of his eye. Minjin noticed Hanyul watching, his expression darkening. After dinner, as they walked back to their chambers, Hanyul's silence felt heavy. The moment they entered the room, Hanyul shut the door firmly. Are you finished? He asked, his voice low and charged with a tension that Minjin hadn't seen before. Finished with what? Minjin replied, faking innocence, though his heart raced at Hanyul's intense gaze. Hanyul moved closer, and before Minjin could respond, he felt his back press against the wall, Hanyul's hand trapping him. Done with that ridiculous game. You flirting with Taijo as if I'm not watching. Minjin raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. So you were watching, he replied, a hint of a challenge in his tone. Maybe it's because you're jealous. Hanyul's eyes narrowed. Jealous? Hardly. I'm just reminding you where you belong. In one swift motion, he lifted Minjin and guided him to the bed. Wait, what are you doing? Minjin stammered, his cheeks flushing as Hanyul hovered above him, his gaze fierce and unwavering. You're my husband, Minjin. Hanyul murmured, his voice a low growl. You shouldn't look at anyone else the way I look at you. Minjin's heart raced as he met Hanyul's gaze. Hanyul's eyes softened, something vulnerable flashing across his face as his fingers traced Minjin's cheek before finally pulling back. Though he released Minjin, the atmosphere in the room was still charged, and as they lay in bed, settling in for the night, Minjin couldn't help but feel that perhaps Hanyul's jealousy had revealed more about his heart than either of them had anticipated. The next day, as Minjin walked through the palace gardens, he ran into Taijo again. Taijo was leaning casually against a pillar, eyes scanning the area before landing on Minjin. Ah, there you are, my favorite garden companion, he said, voice flirty as usual. He came up to Minjin, wrapping his arms around his waist. And that's when Minjin decided that it was enough. Minjin removed his hands from his waist and stood up straighter, crossing his arms. You know, Taijo, he said, meeting his gaze with a fire in his eyes. There's a line, and you're crossing it. You're a charming man, but you're getting a little too familiar. Taijo raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Too familiar, Minjin. He stepped closer, his gaze lingering a little too long on Minjin's lips. I only wish to be your friend. Minjin took a deep breath, holding his ground. We're not friends, Taijo. And if you keep pushing, I'll make sure you know where the line is. He was about to turn to leave when he heard a familiar voice that made his stomach flip. You're right, Minjin. The voice was cold, and it made both men freeze. Hanyul had come out from behind a nearby stone wall. His eyes narrowed, his stance commanding, and Minjin instantly felt the shift in the air. Taijo straightened, his easy smile faltering as he turned to face the prince. What's this, your highness? Taijo asked, his voice smooth, though there was an edge in his words now. Are you upset? Hanyul stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Taijo. You've been pushing my boundaries, Taijo. I don't appreciate it. Without another word, Hanyul moved toward Minjin, his hand wrapping around Minjin's waist. Minjin was still processing, but before he could react, Hanyul pulled him close and kissed him, slow and deeply. A kiss that sent shockwaves through Minjin's chest, leaving him breathless. The world around them seemed to disappear, and for a moment, Minjin forgot where he was, or who was watching. The only thing that mattered was the kiss. the feeling of Han-Yul's lips claiming his. It was possessive, as if Han-Yul was marking his territory. Taijo's eyes widened with a mix of surprise and discomfort. He shifted on his feet, unsure of how to react to the bold display of ownership. Han-Yul finally pulled back, his lips lingering on Minjin's for just a moment longer, before turning back to Taijo. His tone was low and almost threatening. "Leave," Han-Yul ordered, his voice cold but sharp. Taijo blinked, clearly taken aback. I see," he murmured, finally stepping back. He looked between Minjin and the prince, but there was nothing more he could say in the face of Han-Yul's dominance. "I'll take my leave, then." Minjin watched, heart racing, as Taijo turned and walked away. Minjin could feel Han-Yul's gaze burning into him, and it was only then that he realized his body was still pressed against Han-Yul's chest. "Han-Yul," Minjin called out, finally looked up at him, his voice a little shaky. Han-Yul's eyes softened, though his grip on Minjin remained firm, almost possessive. "He had to know his place," Han-Yul murmured, leaning down until his lips were almost brushing Minjin's ear. "And you belong to me, Minjin. I'm not one to share, not when it comes to you." Minjin's heart skipped as he heard those words. Minjin took a deep breath, finally speaking. "I guess I should stop flirting back." Han-Yul's expression softened into something a little more playful. "Oh, don't stop. Just make sure you're not giving him any ideas, all right?" He brushed his thumb over Minjin's lips, a teasing smile at the corner of his mouth. "You're mine now. Keep it that way." Minjin couldn't help but laugh softly, shaking his head. All right, but I'm not going to make things easy for you, Han-Yul." The prince chuckled, his hand sliding down to Minjin's waist, pulling him closer. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The next morning, Minjin lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous night. The kiss, the way Han-Yul had claimed him in front of Taijo, it all felt surreal. He hadn't expected the prince to act so possessive. Minjin shifted in bed and glanced over at Han-Yul, who was still fast asleep beside him, his back facing Minjin. Just as he was about to get out of bed, he heard a soft sound from Han-Yul. Minjin froze, waiting to see if he'd wake up. The prince shifted slightly, his hand moving across the bed, as if searching for something or someone. His fingers brushed Minjin's arm, and for a moment Minjin felt warmth shoot through him. Han-Yul's voice broke the silence. "Minjin?" Minjin froze, unsure how to respond. "Yeah?" he replied hesitantly, his heart suddenly pounding. There was a slight pause, and then Han-Yul, clearly still not fully awake, mumbled, "Did I really do that last night?" His voice was soft, almost shy, and it made Minjin's heart skip a beat. Minjin blinked, sitting up straight. "You mean kiss me?" "Yeah," Han-Yul mumbled, now turning toward him. His face flushed with a hint of embarrassment. Minjin couldn't help but grin at the prince's sudden shyness. This was a side of Han-Yul he hadn't expected. The proud, confident prince from last night was replaced with this awkward shy man in the morning light. "Well, you did," Minjin said, trying to keep his voice casual, though he could feel the blush creeping up his own neck. "And I didn't exactly stop you." He chuckled softly, trying to make the situation less awkward. Han-Yul's eyes darted away for a moment, clearly shy. "I didn't mean to. I mean I did, but I wasn't thinking straight. It's just, you kept looking at me like that, and I couldn't help it." Minjin raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Han-Yul bit his lip, looking away as his cheeks turned an even deeper shade of pink. "Like you wanted me to." Minjin couldn't help but laugh, the awkward tension suddenly easing between them. "Well, maybe you shouldn't be so confident next time if you can't even handle what you did." Han-Yul frowned, but there was no real malice behind it. "I didn't think I'd be the one feeling embarrassed," he muttered, pulling the blanket higher up his chest as if trying to hide behind it. Minjin sat up completely. "Well, I'm glad I'm not the only one feeling awkward. You looked so confident last night. I thought for sure you'd be all proud of yourself this morning." Han-Yul groaned in reply, burying his face in his pillow. Minjin chuckled. And just like that, the tension between them finally started to break. The next day, Minjin was brought a new lesson on what it meant to be married to a prince. He wasn't taught about bedroom etiquette anymore, but his duties ranged from learning court etiquette to memorizing the royal family's history. A task Minjin found particularly boring. Han-Yul seemed to take great pleasure in teasing him about it, which only made Minjin more annoyed. One afternoon, they were in the prince's study, and Minjin, determined to get through the stack of lesson books without Han-Yul's mocking, was failing to keep his irritation in check. Han-Yul stood across the room, leaning back against his desk with a smirk on his face, watching Minjin with amused eyes. "Is something funny?" Minjin asked, slamming one of the books shut and glaring at Han-Yul. Just enjoying the view, Hanyul replied, crossing his arms with a smug grin. You're very cute when you're frustrated. Minjin's face flushed. You're supposed to be helping me, you know, not staring at me like some creep. Hanyul's smirk grew. Why help when I can watch you suffer? What a great husband you are, Minjin muttered, rolling his eyes. Maybe you're just bad at paying attention, Hanyul retorted, stepping closer. Perhaps if you focused more, you wouldn't struggle so much with these simple duties. Minjin scowled, closing the book he has been pretending to read. Simple. Oh, forgive me, your highness, that I wasn't raised in a castle, learning all the proper ways to bow, speak and even breathe. He narrowed his eyes, standing up and facing Hanyul. Maybe if you stopped hovering and actually helped me, I'd be able to finish. Help you? Hanyul raised an eyebrow, now close enough that Minjin could feel his warmth. You're the one who always insists on doing things yourself. Oh, really? Minjin's tone was defiant, his voice rising. If that's what you think, maybe I should. Before he could finish, he tripped over the edge of the rug, his balance tipping forward. Hanyul reacted instinctively, reaching out and grabbing Minjin's arms to steady him. They stumbled together. Minjin pressed against Hanyul's chest, faces mere inches apart. They froze, the sudden close proximity turning their argument into a moment of silence. Minjin felt his heart racing as he looked up at Hanyul. Hanyul's gaze had softened, his usual teasing replaced with something else. Are you okay? Hanyul's voice was softer now, barely above a whisper. Yeah, I'm fine, Minjin replied, his own voice quieter, the sassiness gone. For a moment, neither moved. Minjin's eyes flicked to Hanyul's lips, and his heart skipped a beat. He knew he should pull back, but something kept him rooted in place. Without thinking, he leaned forward just a little, and Hanyul, almost as if on instinct, met him halfway. Their lips brushed in the gentlest of kisses. It was nothing like the heated, possessive kiss in front of Taijo. This one was slower, softer, like they were both testing unfamiliar ground. But once they started, neither of them could stop. The kiss deepened and their hands reached out, gripping each other, as though afraid the other might disappear. Hanyul's fingers found their way to the small of Minjin's back, pulling him closer, while Minjin's hand rested against Hanyul's chest, feeling the fast beat of his heart. Minjin's cheeks flushed as he pulled back, only to have Hanyul's hand slip around his neck, drawing him back into another kiss, this one more intense, and the growing heat between them became undeniable. Somewhere between their hurried, breathless kisses, Hanyul whispered against his lips, "Are you sure?" Minjin nodded, his own breath catching as he replied, "Yes." What followed was a blur of clothings coming off, and whispers of encouragement from Hanyul. Wrapped against each other, they both discovered something new about the other. There was laughter and a mix of awkwardness and shyness that made everything feel more real. Hanyul's teasing turned to gentle touches, and Minjin's sassy remarks softened into quiet moans, both of them sharing something deeper than they'd expected. Later, as they lay in bed tangled together, Hanyul's fingers traced gentle patterns along Minjin's arm. Just as Minjin was about to drift off, Hanyul murmured, "If this is what being married to you is like, I think I could get used to it." Minjin smiled, his hand finding Hanyul's, intertwining them together. "You'll have to, because I'm not going anywhere." "Minjin," Hanyul started, his voice serious. "We've done everything as the court demanded, but I think we deserve a choice to do this. Not as a political marriage, but as something we choose for ourselves." Minjin's cheeks flushed, but he held Hanyul's gaze, his own heart pounding. "Are you saying you want us to have our own wedding?" Hanyul nodded, a small smile pulling at his lips. "Yes, a proper wedding. Just the two of us, with the people we care about. No court demands, no pressures. Something real, for us." Minjin blinked, feeling a wave of emotion rise in his chest. He hadn't expected Hanyul to think this way, to even consider that they deserved a real wedding, a real start. "I'd like that too," he replied, his voice soft. "I didn't think you'd care about that sort of thing." "I didn't either," Hanyul admitted, leaning forward, "until I met you." The preparations for their private wedding began soon after. They kept everything simple but meaningful. Minjin's twin sister, who'd been initially betrothed in his place, was overjoyed, laughing as she helped him pick out robes. When the day finally arrived, close friends and family gathered, including Minseo, Minjin's twin sister, who had taken it upon herself to see that everything went perfectly. There was a warmth in the air that had nothing to do with the temperature. As Hanyul waited in his ceremonial robes, he could feel his heart thumping in his chest. This wasn't some court formality. This was his choice, his marriage. Then, as the music began, Minjin appeared at the end of the aisle. Their eyes met, and in that moment the rest of the world faded away. Minjin could hardly believe this was happening, that they had both chosen to make this real. When he reached Hanyul, there was no forced smile or stiff nod. Instead, he took Hanyul's hands in his own and squeezed. The ceremony was brief but beautiful, each vow exchanged holding an authenticity that neither had felt when they were first forced together. I vow to stand beside you, not just as my duty, but as my choice, Hanyul said softly, his voice carrying over the room. To learn from you, to challenge you, to care for you. Minjin, feeling his throat tighten, took a deep breath before speaking his own vows. I promise to be by your side, to share laughter and stubbornness, and maybe even my breakfast if you're lucky. The guest chuckled, and I promise that this is my choice too. After the vows, as tradition dictated, they were to share their first kiss as a married couple. Minjin looked at Hanyul with a shy fond smile. With a deep breath, Hanyul leaned forward and gently kissed him. The temple erupted in cheers, but for Minjin, it was as if they were the only two people in the room. It was a true beginning, a marriage sealed not by duty, but by love. The end.